Back. So the first part of the review, we covered slides 1 through 6. It only took 5 minutes, so we're just going to race through this. So here is slide number 7, and some of the things that you could additionally write about this piece would be, number one, that it is an example of oil painting, French Impressionism. You could mention about how there's a mirror behind her, and it's kind of unclear as to whether we are seeing ourselves in the reflection, or are we seeing her back in the reflection, or the reflection of another server, which I think is probably more likely. And you could talk about how she's clearly kind of tired and overworked, and that and other things. You could discuss how you could actually see just the hint of a trapeze artist in the upper left-hand corner, and then you could also mention that the Bass beer bottle has pretty much not changed much at all since 1882. All right, Madam X, John Singer Sargent. We talked about this painting in a number of ways. Probably first of all, we talked about how it's an example of a limited palette, nearly monochromatic, in that it is a earth tone palette. And what's amazing about this painting is how much color is created with such a very limited range, right? Like a little bit of a cool red, probably something like an alizarin crimson. But other than that, it's pretty much just neutrals and earth pigments. Yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, maybe something like a turkey umber in there to give that slight greenish cast to it. And we also talked about it in terms of figure-ground relationships, about how kind of like how much it's paying attention to the negative space and the negative shapes that it's creating. And then we also discussed the issues of the scandal around it and the whole issue of the chain straps added to the painting. So those are some things you could discuss. All right, Jour Sera, Sunday afternoon on Le Grand Jatte. And probably the most important thing is to discuss, if you're going to talk about anything, I mean, it is an oil painting. It is at the Art Institute of Chicago. It was featured in Ferris Bueller, so those are all things you might mention. But probably the most important thing would be that it's an example of this particular direction of post-impressionist French art, which we sometimes refer to as Pointillism, where artists were interested in the idea of optical mixing, of trying to create color and mixtures of color, but not through mixing them on the palette and then painting them, but rather by putting pure pigment down on the painting in really tiny little dots and allowing the mixture to occur more in our eyes. And how it somewhat gets at this, but somewhat not as successful as like what actually happens on our computer screen, but it's an amazing painting nonetheless. All right, Van Gogh, and we talked about this painting a number of ways. We talked about the almost, the very limited, almost kind of analogous organization of the palette, but we also talked about it in terms of how it functions in terms of like visual pathways, how it's a little bit hard to figure out how your eye enters the space, but how your eye then moves through the space. And yeah, those are probably the main things, other than that I always talk about how much I love this painting. Okay, so number one, it's a photograph, Henri Cartier-Bresson, and it's an example of this kind of aesthetic that he often referred to as the sort of the decisive moment. He was aiming for, once again, I am sorry for the dogs. Like I said, it's a busy, crazy time right now. And so the other thing we talked about, besides Bresson and the decisive moment, is this idea of how this particular photograph is creating movement in a lot of different ways, both in the blur and the distortion that we see on the bicycle, but also through the repetition of shapes, the way the stairs create this spiral that then leads into this big arc of the roadway, and all that leads your eye directly to the bicycle. All right, and So for Jenny Holzer, is an example of, you could call this conceptual art or installation. You wouldn't describe this as a photograph, although it has to be documented by a photograph. The photograph is not the art, if that makes sense. Okay. And all right, that brings us next to the slide reactions, and I'll get that in the next part. And shoot, forgot what I do.